Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Usually when we're not doing a recording, what we'll do is we'll front load a bunch of introductions and we'll have some wins that we talk about. Since we're doing a recording today, what we're going to do is we're going to pretty much just launch right into the presentation so that we can get that recording done. And then once Brandon is done with his presentation, we'll cut off the recording, and that's when we'll take care of some of the in-person group business. So without too much further ado, I want to introduce Brandon Olin, Dev Black Ops. He's going to talk about PowerShell classes. This is a presentation that he's working on for later in the year, and we're really happy to have him here and use this as a test audience. So here you go.
All right, so like Bill said, my name is Brandon Olin, Dev Black Ops on Twitter. I'm a cloud architect at Columbia Sportswear, and this talk is about PowerShell classes and more specifically the dragons or issues that you will find once you start really digging into these that you may not find in the marketing material or blogs or technical publications about them. And this is this presentation may be a little raw. This is a practice run for myself when I'm gonna be giving this at the PowerShell and DevOps Global Summit in April. So please, give me feedback, good or bad, about the content of this and how it's delivered. That'll help me greatly as well. So. First off, I'm going to ask, how many people have actually used PowerShell classes or read about them or played with them at all? So are you guys using them in any production code or just experimenting with them? Okay. So hopefully this will help you once you actually start getting into them. This will show you some of the dark corners where you shouldn't go. The deck and code will be at these addresses. The deck is not published yet. As soon as it's done, I'll release that. The code is out there. Code just goes to a GitHub repository, and I'm gonna later on put these on the user groups repository as well. This is our agenda. This is intentionally very light on slides. This is really all about the code and I want to get down to that as quick as possible. But this is what I'm going to talk about is, in general, what are PowerShell classes? Why would you use them? And the bulk of this is the gotchas, once you actually start using them, what you may encounter. And then, of course, Q&A at the end. So this is a very basic example of what a class is in PowerShell. On the left, you see the syntax for defining a object or a class and different properties associated with that object. Like in this case, obviously, we're defining what a car looks like in PowerShell and a couple of basic properties about that. You know, any car will have a manufacturer, a model, a year, and some type of actions that you can do on that. In this case, it's very, very basic. There's one action called drive. At the bottom is how you instantiate that new class with the new method. On the right-hand side, you have an example of how you can, and this is really one of the benefits of using classes is code reuse. This is how you can extend a class and create a new class from it. In this case, I'm creating a new class called Tesla, extending from car, and giving it a couple additional attributes like max speed and range, and also setting its manufacturer, model, and year to what is specific to a Tesla. This is a very basic example of just defining a class, extending it. But what this shows you can reuse a lot of code in a base class or subsequent classes. And this is, I think, more useful when you start getting into more advanced scripts or maybe even entire applications created with PowerShell. is where these types of traditional software development methods become more useful. You can certainly do this in your day-to-day admin scripts. It may or may not be overkill in those cases, but when you start creating really complex applications or frameworks in PowerShell, I think you kind of have to take a different approach to these, and classes in PowerShell is a way to do that. But the whole point of this presentation is when you start doing that, what are the issues that you're going to probably run into? Why use a class? Like I just said, these are more software development ideas, separation of concerns. When you start creating applications or big frameworks in PowerShell, you want, this is really to keep you sane. You want to separate out this code and what it does from this code and the duties of it. And a class is a container that separates this code does these things on this object, this class does these things on this other object. Inheritance, like I said earlier, you can inherit classes and create base functionality in one class and start extending that as you get more and more advanced and create more and more capabilities. You can reuse code that you've already written or even overload it and modify it in different use cases. And that's all for the slides. Not in PowerShell. So in C#, it's much more powerful in C#. And in PowerShell, you have the concept of public and private properties inside a class. And I'm going to show you some of the issues with that. But the class functionality in PowerShell is pretty basic, especially compared to C#. So what I'm going to show you here is just about a dozen scenarios that you may encounter when you start using classes. And these kind of go in order of complexity. First one is I need to, everything in the class is based on a PowerShell module, and hopefully everyone here has had experience creating modules from scratch in PowerShell. That's a kind of a key component of this. Here, I'm going to say I have a module called my class. So let's take a look at that. The base requirement for module. You and a very basic module just says this is a class called foo. It has one property called name, and I want to use this thing. So let's go ahead and do that. And I can't. Now, why is that? I imported the module. It seemed to import fine. The only thing in my module is that one class. Why can't I go and interact with it? And the main issue is that import module does not export classes like it does with functions and commandlets or aliases or any normal things you do in PowerShell. Classes are not exposed with it. So basically, import module is not useful to do classes this way. And I'm going to show you a different way to do it. But if you want to use classes and you want to import them from a module, it's not going to happen if you don't want to use them directly like this. And if anyone has any questions or want me to expand on something, you can stop me at any point. The preferred and documented way to use classes directly in PowerShell is with this new construct called using module. What that internally is doing is importing the module, just like import-module does. It's also doing some other things behind the scenes, but it exposes that class to your session. Go ahead. It does. There are some gotchas with using module as well, which is in one of these, and the differences between how it acts versus import module. The dollar using, no, totally different, yeah. Overloaded term, but yes, yeah, entirely different thing. So just to be safe, between each one of these, I'm going to restart my session, because that's another thing you'll find with working with classes, especially developing them, is it can be, you can be not really quite sure what version or what code you're actually running. When you're writing a class, reloading it, interacting with the different versions of it, it can really be confusing. So what I just personally do when I'm developing this and testing, I just restart the console every time. So let's do this one. I can't type. Can't type at all. I can create a new instance of the class. You can see there it's type foo and has one property called name. And I can do, you know, this, and as far as this goes, this is normal PowerShell. I can interact with that. I can change its value just like any other PowerShell object. You can see that the myClass module was imported by that using module statement. But like I said earlier, there are some issues with using module. Sure. On this one right here? Those are built into the object. I mean, ultimately, this is all inheriting from system.object, which you're going to find those in. So in this case, I'm going to use import module again to import the car, in this case, the car module. And this is a case where you can interact with classes inside a module using import module. This is the trick you have to do, though. First off, let's look at that car module. You see here, and this is a common thing that many people do in their PowerShell modules. They abstract away most of the code and public and private functions into separate files, and they dot source them in the PSM1. That's what I personally do, even with classes, but I'm going to show you where that falls down. And I also have a normal PowerShell function called new car that's going to create a new instance of that car class, because what is possible is that class that I just dot sourced right here. Let's actually look at that. Very basic class. I dot sourced it here. That class is available within the module. You can use it like any other thing. And I can return it, and that's the sole purpose of this new car function is I'm going to create a new instance of that class and return it to the calling session. Why is version come up first and verbose, when verbose should come up first alphabetically? Anyway, so you can see I imported the module just fine. If I say new car, I get an instance back. You can see it has my properties. It's type car. So you can get to classes from a module using import module. You have to wrap them in functions to return them. You can't just instantiate a new instance of the class directly. if anyone has any questions on that, you can go ahead and speak up. Okay, there's a little slightly more complicated version. So our car module has one class. One of the main benefits of classes is I should be able to inherit from classes and create new classes from them, inheriting all the properties and methods from the base class. What I should be able to do also is have those in separate modules. So I have a module with some base classes, and I have another module that I want to extend with additional functionality. You would think that would work. Oh, before I run that, let's just actually look at the Tesla class. And here I am saying normally when you have a module depend on another module, in your manifest you say required modules equals whatever your required modules are. That does not work if you want to expect to get classes out of that module. Internally, what required modules is doing is importing the module, but we just saw that you can't instantiate classes directly using that. So let's see what it does. Can't find the car module. Sorry. Let's check that out. So I can import the car module just fine. You see that it's loaded. I should be able to create a car from it. But like I just said, required modules doesn't import classes. So I have the car module installed now. Can I import Tesla? No, I can't. It can't access that car module. Can I even instantiate a car directly? I can't. Now, why is that? I imported car with import module like you do any other normal module. What's wrong with it? Like I showed you earlier, normally, or at least a lot of people, dot source classes or dot source PowerShell files in the PSM1 to keep them having a giant monolithic PSM1. I personally do this with pretty much every module, but especially big ones, when I want to avoid like a 10,000 line PSM1 file. But this does not work with classes. With classes, using module, that class needs to be in the PSM1 for it to be exposed. Using module internally does some parsing of the PSM1 to find class instances and exposes them. It doesn't go down the tree and go to dot source files and recursively look at subsequent files. It only looks at the PSM1 and exposes those modules. So if you want them exposed, you need to put them in the PSM1, which kind of leads back to a giant monolithic PSM1 file. So let's fix it in the car module. So I'm no longer going to dot source it and define it directly. Now I can import it. Can I do this? No, I can't. But I can create a new Tesla. Internally, the Tesla module has access to the car module. I still don't have access to the car module directly. My Tesla module, using module, so it has access to it, but me in a parent session doesn't. So these are the kinds of things you start running into when you start getting really deep into classes and creating, inheritance and many different classes. When you see lots of demos online of creating, very simple classes, and hey, look how great these are. This is the stuff you run into when you actually try to use them for real. And try to share them with other modules. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. Another issue with this is order matters. Normally, when you're defining a bunch of functions in a module and you dot source it, the order of them and which one executes what, if they're not actually, if you're just defining a function, it doesn't matter what order they're in. Classes, it matters. When PowerShell is parsing this and interpreting it, it's going right down the line. And it says, I want to define a new class called Tesla that relies on car, or say inheriting from the car module, sorry, the car class. It's going to error out immediately. Saying, I don't know what this car is. Well, car is defined down below. It hasn't even gotten to it yet. This is another issue, which I'll show you later on. When you do want to keep your classes in separate files and import them, you have to consider the order of your importing those matters when you're inheriting. This is not an issue if this Tesla was not inheriting from car, because they're standalone. But since this does rely on it, it matters. So let's swap this. And now that works. Sorry, my throat's really dry because my 4-year-old or my 1.5-year-old gave me something. So your question about like private properties and public properties, this is, I wouldn't call it like a big issue, but this is just something to be aware of. And I know a little bit of C#. I'm not a C# developer, so I don't know the ins and outs. But PowerShell doesn't have this concept of a private property like you do in C#. It has the concept of hidden, but hidden is just that. It's hidden. If you know where to look, you can find it. So here I'm defining a class called foo. One public property, not specifying hidden implies that it's public, called name, and another hidden property called secret. If I run this, so I got my foo object. Now, I only see the name property, not the secret property. But if you use force, you can see a couple different methods. You can also see that secret property. It's not private. You can easily get to it. So hidden is not. It's not meant to prevent access to properties. You can easily get to them. It's really, I think, more of a convenience, say, of implying that this is a property that's internal to the class. Don't mess with it, but it's not enforced. As you can see, I can get that. Oh, you don't also have tab completion with these. So I'm hitting tab. I don't see that secret But if I do name, I do. But it's still there. And I can change it. So hidden is just that, hidden. Don't use it if you're trying to truly protect information. That's not what it's for. I think, I don't know the official guidance on it other than, you're saying to the developer or the user of this that this is an internal to the class. You shouldn't be using it directly. But there's nothing in the system that prevents you from doing that. All right. Abstract classes. This is much more of a developer thing. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert in this, but it is something that you'll find a lot in C# and other object-oriented languages. There are times when you want to do inheritance. You have base functionality you want that's defined in, say, this animal class, and I want to create child classes that inherit from that. But it makes no logical sense to create an instance of an animal. There is no thing in life that you can say that's an animal. You have types of animals. The animal itself doesn't, you can't make something like that. An abstract class is a way to say that in code, is that this is a base class that implements some functionality, but you can't instantiate an instance of it directly. You have to inherit from it and create new classes. There is no concept of that in PowerShell, but it's all over C#. This is a way to mimic that in PowerShell by saying, well, I'm going to create a class called an animal, and in my constructor, when I create this instance of an animal, I'm going to do a little type checking and say, hey, is the type that I'm creating, am I an animal? If I am, I'm going to throw an error, saying you can't create an instance of me. You're mimicking a little bit the behavior of an abstract class, but this is a runtime check. This is not a compile time check. But this is a method, and there are a couple other examples of trying to do more C# methods in PowerShell. This is just one of them. But I'll show you how this works. So let's copy that. Let's copy this. So I just do a custom error saying you can't create an instance of me because it makes no logical sense. But cow inherits from animal, overloads the make sound method, and I can't create an instance of that, and I can call that method. This is not really a gotcha per se. This is just something that's entirely missing from PowerShell, and this is just an example of how you can mimic that. Again, this is something that you could find useful when you start getting into really advanced modules with lots of classes, lots of inheritance, and you're controlling what people can do with your code. All right, verbose. This is a class that I stole this from Stack Overflow. This was a question that was raised there. How to do, verbose and debug messaging inside classes. Normally in an advanced function or a commandlet, you run the commandlet or function, you give a -verbose or -debug to run those messages. When you're running a class and you're saying, there is no verbose switch on this. How do you do debugging or make verbose messages when you're calling class methods directly? And the answer is classes, they are aware of verbose and debug, but you have to wrap them in a advanced function or commandlet and have that or your PowerShell session set your verbose or debug preference and then run your class method. And your class method will inherit those values. Does that make sense? I'll show you this. So let's create that class. In this case, it's a simple class that has a constructor that's saying when I'm instantiating a new instance of it in my constructor, I'm going to write a verbose message. When I call this getMyName method, I'm also going to write a debug message as well as a verbose message. Now, I just said that you have to wrap those in functions to make use of verbose and debug. So invoke normal function is going to create a new instance of that class and call it. What does it do? So it outputs this string right here. No debug. I have no verbose debug switches. Why don't I? Well, the answer is that is this a straight PowerShell function. You don't get verbose and debug with these. And what I certainly do, and I recommend, is just make this a habit all the time. Anytime you create a function in PowerShell, add this bit of code here to make this an advanced function. You just get a bunch of free functionality. So this advanced function is going to do the same thing. So that works the same way. I also have verbose, and I have debug. So you can make use of those within your classes, but you have to wrap them in functions, in advanced functions, I should say. And I also I mentioned earlier, it does work with the verbose and debug preference variables as well. So here I'm going to just make sure my verbose preference is the normal. You can see I can create a new instance of the class, no verbose messaging. Let's set my verbose preference to continue, meaning spit out these verbose messages. I can create a new instance and it uses it. Debug, same thing. Any questions with verbose in classes? All right. Parameter validation. This is an interesting one. A lot of people do parameter validation in functions and say, hey, I'm going to accept a string. This string can only be 10 characters long, or this integer can be 1 through 100, things like that. Class methods have you have no way to, so in a normal PowerShell function in parameters, you can attach these attributes to say, range equals 1 through 100 and so forth. In a class method, you don't have that capability. This is a interesting way to work around it. I have not personally used this. I saw this example out there when I was doing some research, and I thought I'd show it to you. If you wanted to do validation on parameters sent to class methods, what you can do is you can create a purpose-built class that does that validation for that parameter type, and then use that in your method. So here I'm going to create a class called validatedName. I can create an instance of that class, and its sole purpose is to control the value of, in this case, value, saying that this property can only be 3 to 15 characters long. and I have a class that's going to use that. So when I call the myMethod method, it's going to accept an instance of that class, and by the fact of me doing this, it's casting the value that I send to it, and in this case I'm sending a string. It's going to attempt to cast that to a value of validated name, and it's going to work, and that's going to also force it to run this validation attribute against it. So, whoops. So I have my class. And that works, passive validation. Here I'm sending it two character string. That parameter validation of 3 to 15 prevents that from working. It's kind of convoluted, honestly, to do this. I'm just showing you this is something that you could do. It's probably much more realistic that when you're working with these classes, they're being used in advanced functions and getting parameters passed to them, and do your normal parameter validation the normal PowerShell way. But this is just an interesting method. Who uses the requires, I guess I forget the correct term for these, but this qualifier on a PowerShell script, like, requires or run as administrator, or requires module version. So you can do it with module as well, and I've seen this, and I've done this myself, although I've come to think it's an anti-pattern. Flat out, it just doesn't work with classes in those modules, and I'll show you why. So this car module up here, let me run this first to make sure that my current directory is in my PowerShell path. So I can import the module car. I can see it loaded. I can see I create a new instance of it. Now let's take this out and pretend that we were doing it this way. It doesn't technically need to be at the beginning of the line. It just needs to be the first executable item on the script. That's another interesting thing. Using module. Same deal. That statement has to be the first executable line in your script. You can put as many comments as you want above it, but using module has to be the first thing that the script actually executes. You can't nest it in an if statement or put it inside a function in the script. If you dot source that script, using module has to be the first thing that PowerShell executes, meaning it's usually at the very top. You can have multiple using modules, but you can't have anything in between them. Yeah. I don't remember if you can put them like in an array inline. And then one of the next examples, if you ever use module specifications, where you specify the name of the module and the version in a hash table, that does work, kind of. I'll show you why. All right, so I have required. Let's see if I can just dot source this. First, sorry, got to do this first. Make sure it's not loaded. Make sure that my current directory is in my module path. Can't do it. I'm saying import module car, and it did. You can see car is loaded, but again, I can't use that class directly. Now, if I were using that class within a function, it would work fine. Again, just like with import module, Because probably under the covers, that's what it requires actually doing. You have the same issue. All right, so here's here's another gotcha. So I added my current directory in the path, which means if I use get module, look for anything available, I should see this fruit class, and I do. I see multiple versions because I have multiple versions of this fruit class, or this, fruit module. Now, from the command line, I can also say using module fruit, and it will work. It'll import it. And it imports version 2, the latest, just like import module does by default. It's going to import the latest. What if I want to import version 1? This technically does work using module, and you give it a use. So sorry, I should go back up. Import module, fruit, required version. That's how you normally do it in PowerShell. They import a specific version. Now I got version 1 and 2 loaded. Let's reset. Because again, like I said, putting these in and out of your session sometimes can get PowerShell in a funky state. So I'm going to say using module, fruit, version 1. Why is it importing version 2? Version 2. I'm sure that's a bug. I didn't see an issue in PowerShell repository about it. Whoops, I don't want Z shell. But that is the current issue, at least that I've experienced. If I want to use using module and specify the version, it's not going to work. Using that method anyway. You can see, yeah, version 2. Okay. Can I import the one directly? This should work. Fruit version 2. Version 2 is loaded. I can run new apple, and I get an apple. The only difference between these version 1 and 2s is version 2 had a calories property, version 1 didn't. Did we get 3? Yeah. So, what am I doing on time? Okay. Last demo. This is an example of a complex module, and when I say complex, what I mean is this is a module that has, you'll see a lot of examples online of PowerShell modules with a private and a public folder, where that's where your private and public functions are, and at the root you just have your PSM1, and really the sole purpose of your PSM1 is just to dot source private and public and export them. That's what I personally do in mine. And that's what I did when I first started a PowerShell module that was solely based on classes. And I want to keep all these classes in separate modules. And I quickly found out that that doesn't work. This is the way that I'm personally doing it with my modules when I use classes. I am compiling PowerShell modules, and I'll show you what that really looks like. So imported the module. I have a function called new planet. It gives me back a class that's of type Earth. So it's using my PowerShell classes. Again, can I use Earth directly? No, I can't. But I want the best of both worlds. I'll show you what this looks like. So complex module has an empty PSM1. Your public functions would go in a public subfolder, private in another, classes in another, and this is where you do your separate class files. So Earth, Mars, planet is your base class. Earth and Mars obviously inherit from that. Order matters, is that I inherit in dot sourcing, so I need the dot source in a certain order. So in my case, I'm using Saki to have a build task that compiles. Really, it doesn't compile; it just concatenates files together into one giant PSM1. What I'm doing here is creating a module on the fly, and I'm outputting it to a bin folder, which just has your PSD1 and your PSM1. In this case, the PSM1 has the contents of each one of these files appended to it. And this is so I can import the module with using module, import the module with import module, and also reference those classes from other modules. But there are, still gotchas with it that I showed earlier. But this is the way that I came up with to make using classes and modules sane as much as I could make it personally. But so in my build task, I'm creating an output folder called bin with a version. I'm looping through files, and this is a downside here. I have many files in the class, or a couple files in the class directory. Normally, you would just say get child item on classes and loop through them. Order matters, though, so you have to loop through that in a certain order. One way you could do it is this kind of goes back to basic, is ordering your files 01, 02, 03 to force the order. Basically like line 10, go to 20 and 30 and stuff like that. I tried that for a while, but then you create a new class that inherits from, class 3, and you decide to inherit from 2, or inherit from 1, but you got to rename everything to make them all order. So I was like, well, screw that. That's not sustainable. The easiest way that I've done it is I just manually define the order in the build task. I have about like 30 classes and a module this way. It's not that horrible to do this. But this is just a manual. There is a project out there that I've played with someone that I know who is working to dynamically figure out the order of classes and what depends on what, and then order and load them in order. That is still a challenge. But what this task does, loops through all these classes, adds them into a PSM1, adds the private and public functions into the PSM1. Order in those cases don't matter. Copies the PSD1 over to the output directory, and boom, you have a compiled module that is usable. So those are those I have. If anyone has any questions on those. Classes came up in PowerShell 5. They really haven't changed much that I've noticed in 5.1 and 6. I haven't done a whole lot personally with that. Yeah. Only so much pain at once. These are the key takeaways. with classes and the gotchas with them. Like I said, import module does not expose those classes to your session. Using module does, but there are issues with using module, like versioning. You cannot dot source the class files in the PSM1 if you wish to expose those classes to the outside world. If they're just meant to be internal to the module, that works perfectly fine. But if you want to share those outside and have another module inherit from them, can't do that. You have to put them in the PSM1. Order matters. I should say order matters only if classes depend on each other. If they're completely independent, you can load them in any order. No secrets. Class properties are not private or protected. They are hidden, and they're not hidden very well. Requires does not import classes, because internally it's just running import module. It doesn't expose them to the session. And there are other issues with it, which I can talk offline about why I think it's kind of a bad idea to use that to import modules anyway. You can use it for other things. I personally still think they're cool, classes. My big project that I use them with PoshBot is a chat ops framework in PowerShell. It's like 99% classes. And once I got through these issues and figured it out, I'm pretty quick with them and know how to work them in and out. But it was a pain to go through some of these issues. And mostly, it all comes down to importing modules and exposing those classes. That's really, all these things kind of interrelate to that. So that's what I have. Here's where you can find me. And here are some other GitHub projects that I'm involved with, Saki, PoshBot, some other personal projects that you'll find out there. Those bit.ly links will link to this GitHub repo, which this code will live, and also to SpeakerDeck, where the presentation will be. But you can see the presentation is pretty meaningless. But that's where you'll find it. So that's all I have.
All right, so before we stop the recording, I just want to say thanks, Brendan, for coming out, for doing all that work and some of the great work you're doing for the community, especially with Sake right there. I don't know if some of you have heard, he's the main maintainer for Sake, and it's recently. Right, and it's a hugely, hugely useful module. Check it out, definitely, and maybe check out some of the issues and give them a hand. I also want to say thanks to our sponsors. Sapien Software is providing the food and the drinks, as they always do, so thanks to Sapien for that. Thanks to Viewpoint Construction Software for the venue and for just being generally awesome to us specifically and to some of the other software communities in the area. We're not the only user group that they host, so thanks for that. And thanks to Columbia for providing the webcasting resources. And I think with all of that said, we'll go ahead and cut off the recording, and we'll take care of just some in-person user group business. So thanks a lot for watching, and thanks to you guys for coming, and we'll continue in person. Thanks.